Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to the first part in a two-part webinar series, Priming for WPF, Part 1, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. In this session, Paul uses powerful DevExpress WPF components and tools to explain the principles behind WPF, work through the anatomy of a WPF application, and discuss the benefits of design patterns such as MVVM and scaffolding. Thank you for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul Usher.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to part 1 of our WPF primer. Now, when I was looking at the different technologies and things that I'd share with you this year, we started looking at WPF. And my focus is going to be bringing the two-part primer and then looking at how existing WinForm developers can actually move to WPF and what some of those pitfalls and hurdles might be. Then spend a little bit of time looking at the WPF controls in detail and ultimately building a practical real-world WPF application. So that's what I want to plan over the next few months. But of course, a lot of that is dependent on the feedback that we get from you guys as to what you want to see. So please keep that feedback coming in. Now, what I'm not going to be doing today is teaching you everything there is to know about WPF. Both time constraints, and there's a lot really to grasp. So it is very much a top-level primer talking about some of the basics. What I do want to do is just quickly point out that we've got a full-day WPF training event in the States in June. It's presented by our esteemed instructor, Oliver Sturm. Check out the website, go to devexpress.com and look for the training link, or use the short code that's on that slide. It really would be a fantastic day if you want to sharpen those skills when it comes to an in-depth view on our controls. So what am I going to be talking about? Well, first of all, we'll take a look at the future of desktop development and what that actually means. And then we'll break down some of the WPF principles. We'll talk about the MVVM process or design pattern. We'll look at the foundation and history of WPF. I'll then go into detail and look at some zamel. We'll talk about the layout of a WPF application and the visual trees. We'll then look at events and finally binding. We'll end up today's session by taking a look at some of the demo applications that we ship with our DevExpress subscriptions. And then next week, I'll do a quick recap and we will dive more into the MVVM process because I think it's so critical that developers start to harness what that's all about in their application development and when you look at the ALM or application lifecycle itself. We'll then build a very simple application introducing you to the DevExpress scaffolding, the design time assistance, using our basic controls and how to do some complex binding. And then we'll wrap up next week with a detailed question and answer section. We will be answering questions today. I've got some of the team on the call, so if you want to ask a question, feel free to do so in the GoToWebinar question panel. Now, when I started talking to different groups here in Australia about what I was going to focus on this year, the first thing I got back was WPF is dead. I mean, after all, Silverlight's been given its end-of-life date, and a lot of people were thinking that WPF was going the same route. What was even more interesting is then people would come back and take it one step further, and they'd tell me that desktop development was actually going to be dead, and that the only way forward was the web. Now, if we think about the fact that Silverlight tried to compete in a space with Flash and with HTML, JavaScript, etc., there's a reason that it's been deprecated. But I think, and if you look at Microsoft's own information and roadmaps, that neither of those facts are particularly true. WPF is not dead, and desktop development simply can't go away. See, so many companies have based their livelihoods or their products on things like the Microsoft desktop technologies. If we take a look at WinForms, we know that the runtime is stable and extremely robust. Whilst the .NET platform has been around since early 2000, we're still based on top of the underlying architecture, so user and GDI, which has been around since design of the 80s. So that's some 20, 30-year technology. We know it works. And Microsoft do a great job of each version of Windows providing that backwards compatibility for those different projects. Now, WPF itself is still being worked on. And it was introduced into the .NET Framework at version 3 around about 2006. So some 9 years later, it's still very much an active technology. And then we think about the phrase zamel, which we see used around in different things. It's basically the declarative language used for defining UI across a number of different technology stacks. So WPF, the universal apps, it's used in Windows Phone as well as desktop development. And you'll see companies like Xamarin are also using it inside their products. Traditional WinForms is still going strong, and we know that it's been tried and tested. And according to Microsoft, it's still going to be around for a while. Now, some people would argue that if you're going to use WinForms, you get a better Visual Studio design experience. Some take it even further to say that it's actually quicker to spin up a new application inside WinForms than any other technology. And in certain instances, faster than doing console because you've got more visual feedback. Where does that leave WPF? Well, I think WPF is definitely the future. It's been actively developed. And it was only last year, November, that Microsoft published what they're calling their roadmap for WPF, which gives us a bit of an insight into some of the things that we're going to see coming out this year with .NET 4.6. See, the WPF team have been working hard on improving the tooling, improving the interaction with the DirectX libraries, and releasing things like a new version of Blend, better visual diagnostics inside Visual Studio. There's a lot of work coming through, and if you were to watch some of the links and videos associated with that blog post, then it becomes quite an exciting time to be looking at moving to the WPF technology stack. Based on the fact that WPF uses DirectX, it's going to have better performance when it comes to visual rendering. And you see, the older technologies such as GDI has come across through all those decades. Yes, there's been minor improvements, but the underlying engine was not designed to take control of a lot of the more modern architecture, and we'll look at that shortly. Some people think that WPF is just eye candy, and that you can do, you can do some fancy little animations or other bits and pieces, but it's a lot more than that because it's built on a vector technology. Now, more and more devices are being introduced into the marketplace today with high definition resolutions, so retina-style displays. And if you've tried to run typical legacy applications on a retina display or a high-resolution DPI device, you find that everything is too small. There's no scaling, and that's because traditional WinForms was not designed for it. Conversely, WPF, it's out of the box. You don't have to do much to actually take control or get the benefit of that scaling. WPF has inherently better binding, and we'll see some of that when we look at the MVVM model. One thing that I found developers aren't always aware of is the fact that you can actually add WPF to your existing WinForms applications right now. And I know that a number of years ago, I had the pleasure of working on a WinForms application that was visualizing projects, and we wanted to do something a little special to draw the user's attention to a particular aspect. And so we implemented some XAML and the WPF user control in a predominant WinForms application. Now, inside a few lines of XAML, we're able to do what it would have taken hundreds of lines, custom rendering, and timer events to do inside the WinForms application. So you can start adding, you can start learning and introducing WPF to your current projects. It's not a matter of having to throw everything out and start again. And WPF is certainly more in tune with modern standards such as MVVM. If you've got any background in web development, then you might already understand the principles behind MVVM. And let's take a moment and just have a look at what that's all about. So, model, view, view, model. Now, the view part of this is responsible for defining the structure, the layout, and the appearance of what the user is going to see on the screen. Now, ideally, the view would be defined with pure zamel and have very limited code behind, and certainly not contain any business logic. Now, a view can have its own view model, or it can inherit from another view model. So there's different ways of implementing that, but ultimately the view talks to the view model. The model itself implements the application's domain model, including any data or business logic. And examples of that might be things such as a direct business object library or data transfer object, DTOs. It might be just plain old CLR objects, and you might see the phrase POCOs written to refer to that. It could even be things like generated entities or proxy objects. Then the view model acts as an intermediary between the actual view and the model, and it's responsible for handling the view logic. So typically the view is going to interact with the model by invoking methods inside the classes. It's going to provide data from the model in the form that the view can easily use, so properties and so forth. Now typically what will happen is the view model will work in, say, a two-way data binding, and it will introduce things like a property changed event so that one instance or one entity is able to see what's going on. But why is the MVVM principle so important? And we see it a lot, again, when we talk about web design, MVC, and so forth. Well, it's all about that separation of concerns, that you can actually take your business logic or your data layer and keep it away, decouple it from your UI. And there's a number of benefits for this. First and foremost, that you could use the same data layer, business object, or model and have multiple different UI layers to it. So you might have a web interface, you might have a mobile interface, or a desktop, and you're not having to worry about going through and regenerating that same information. We can see here the benefits are that components can be swapped around. You can implement certain internal changes without affecting other things. Components themselves can be worked on independently, and it certainly makes it a lot easier for implementing unit testing. Now, when it comes to the world of WPF, it also opens up a whole wide range that designers can be used to implement some stunning UI, because they're going to be hooking the visual elements up to properties that you're exposing. So you've got this separation there between the UI elements and what's actually happening with the business logic and the main program. So what about the foundation of WPF? Well, if we think back to even the early versions of Windows, they had the user DLL and they had the GDI libraries. And traditional WinForms was using that to do the visualization, the representation. And along came WPF that was designed to work with DirectX, so designed to take control or to harness the power of the graphic card that we saw introduced. And I mean, if we think back, the graphic cards that we have on today's computers themselves are actually more powerful than a computer was 20 years ago in its entirety. So the introduction of DirectX and the ability then to utilize that to get more performance, to get better rendering, and just to provide a lot better visual experience was needed. Now these red areas are actually representing the WPF libraries themselves. What is really interesting here is mil core is actually unmanaged code, and it's responsible for all the tight integration with DirectX. It was designed to be unmanaged to allow for efficient hardware and software rendering, and by moving it out of the CLR meant that there were less cycles on the processor and less interrupt calls going to be made. So it's quite an interesting concept, thinking that part of the WPF framework is outside the managed code base. And then inside the managed code, we've got a couple of core libraries, one being presentation core and the other being framework. When it comes to the namespaces for WPF, if you're a WinForms developer, it can become a little confusing. See, WinForms is based around system.windows.forms. That's predominantly it. WPF is everything else inside system.windows. And we can see here just some of the libraries that get used. So we've got the annotations library, the automation library for implementing screen readers and things like that. So there's a lot available at the root level of the WPF foundation. Now, a lot of people throw around the word XAML. It's a usual acronym standing for Extensible Application Markup Language. And it really is just a declarative markup language that was designed for .NET to simplify UI creation. It's been used in more than one technology. So, for example, WPF, it was used in Silverlight. It's even used in things like Windows Workflow Foundation, which of course is a far step away from what we're talking about with WPF. So when we think about it, XAML doesn't need WPF. And interestingly enough, WPF doesn't need XAML. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we take a look at this simple example, on the left-hand side, we've got some XAML creating a button. And on the right-hand side, I've got the exact same thing happening inside a traditional C# creation. So on the left, we can see XAML is implementing an element called button and then setting some attributes to that. And then we've got the hello world content just sitting between the tag. On the right-hand side, we're seeing the instantiation of a new button element, and then the properties themselves are being set. The result, regardless of which side you run, is the hello world button that you can see at the bottom of the screen. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is the fact that I've got the underscore character at the beginning of the letter H. Traditional WinForms development, that would be an ampersand. But of course, we're now working inside an XML, effectively, type markup. And so it would be really difficult or error-prone to start writing ampersand AMP semicolon every time we wanted that. So the team decided that they'd use a different accelerator key. And all that means is that if you want to use a keyboard shortcut for buttons or controls, you put an underscore in front. When the user presses the Alt key, it's going to then highlight that character. Now, when it comes to thinking of in terms of XAML for a traditional approach, so how does the XAML correspond back to a programming element? Think about elements themselves inside the XAML representing objects. And then as we step through, we'd actually see that attributes and content represent properties. So in our previous example, button.name becomes the converse of the attribute and would be the property inside our class file. The other thing, if you're new to XAML, would be seeing things like this. Now, this is basically a root element of a brand new application, and there's a lot of what look like URLs or schema pointers. Now, they're designed to mimic a URL or a URI, but it's how the namespacing works within WPF. So don't get freaked out when you start seeing all these things. It's not a matter of it having to go off to the web to try and resolve this type of thing. It is interesting if you've got HTML experience or XML experience, seeing how this XAML is created. Typical tags, opening, closing tags with information either set as attributes or content inside. We'll cover a little bit of the layout shortly. One thing that tends to happen when people start playing around with XAML or with their first WPF application, because XAML is so extensible and useful, is everything, they think everything has to be created inside the XAML file. and forget about the fact that you can implement it, or some things, at the code side of it. So don't go XAML crazy. Before we step through the layout, what I'm going to do is jump over to a little tool called zamel, which is a free XAML editor. Microsoft used to ship one called XAMLpad back with Visual Studio 2008, but it's been missing in action for a while. And if you just want to play around with basic XAML, it's a great place to start. As I said, it is free. Just head over to kazaml.net, I think it was, and download. Completely open source. Now what we can see at the bottom of the page here is my actual XAML that I'm going to be working on, and it's going to get rendered at the top. So I'm working inside a page element, and we'll look more about what these elements contain shortly. And then I've got this grid element. So think of that as a wrapper around a control or multiple controls. The nice thing inside this particular tool is as I start typing, it's going to show me the different things that are available. But I'm going to introduce a button. And this button is going to have some text, which is simply hello world. Now, if I render that, we're going to see that the button is taking up by default the whole of the canvas or the page. I can see as I move my mouse over, it changes color to indicate that I've actually got that in place. So what I can do is actually apply a couple of attributes inside the button tag, and let's start by doing something like font family, and we'll set that to something nice and strange like show card Gothic. Just re-render that for a second, and we can see that's changed. But of course the font's looking a little small, so let's change the font size to say 60. Now, of course, the beauty here is that the render engine is taking care of all the niceness, the smoothness of that element. I'm just applying these, and it's going to build it for me in real time. I'll set a couple more properties. We'll go with a height property and a width property. So we can see then that now we have our page on the outside, and we have a button which of course isn't hooked up to anything but can come through. And it really should be as simple as that for creating elements for your XAML document. Now, as with the likes of HTML, some people love working directly in the code, some people prefer a visual designer. One of the things we're looking forward to in Visual Studio 2015 are the improvements for the visual designer, because frankly up until now it leaves a lot to work. It's difficult to work with. That's all there is to it. As far as tools for WPF, you've actually got Visual Studio and the designer in there, which we'll get to, and also tools such as Blend. Now think of Blend as a Photoshop for WPF designers. It allows you to work with the project, set the properties, hook events, etc. up really nicely. So up until now, between those two things, developers and designers have been able to achieve what they want. The more people play around with XAML as far as a code base, the more you get used to working inside the actual XAML code itself. If I want to very quickly just change the font, let's change it to stencil, and it's going to render, etc. Now there's a couple of interesting things when it comes to binding and using binding for these attributes, which I'll cover when we get to that part. So as far as layout itself goes, there's a number of pre-built basic controls. Now here we're talking about the stuff that's out of the box for WPF. A little bit later on I'm going to take you through the whole extra layers and things that we've built inside our WPF toolkits to really enhance productivity and visualization and make your life as a developer easier. But we're still dealing with the basics. So as you can see, we've got things like the password box, scroll bars, progress bars, etc. All the usual things that you'd expect if you've done any kind of WinForms development in the past. But as we saw, the actual construction of the interface is done inside layout panels. And there's a number of different ways to do that. For example, you've got the stack panel, you've got the wrap panel, direct to the canvas, the dock panel, and the grid. And these will become more clear when we start building sample applications together. Now, because it is built inside that XAML markup, you end up with nested controls. So typically, here's a stack panel that's got a label, text box, and button inside it. And this is what we call the logical tree. Now, for all intents and purposes, when you're working with your application, this really is all you might want to look at. I've got a label, I've got a text box. But of course, one of the things with WPF is that controls don't have any appearance. Unlike a traditional command button in WinForms, a WPF control it's what they call lookless. It has no appearance whatsoever. And instead, the controls get their appearance from templates. To give you a bit of an idea as to what would happen, if we look at what's called the visual tree for the same couple of elements here. So you can see there are a number of hidden attributes or properties around each of those control types. So the label has a border, it has the content presenter and the text blocks. That's, if you think about the makeup of a label, it makes sense. Normally that's always been hidden away from us and we just set some properties. But there are cases where you want to interact with this lower level type breakdown. So why do we need the two different trees? Well, basically, if you want to create your own styles or you want to create your own themes, you need to interact with that visual tree and get access to the different rendering elements, even down to where your hit tests and things might actually work. And it starts to get a little, I suppose, confusing at the outset, but again, as we build things out, it will start to make a little more sense. So next in line is going to be the events and commands. Typically, WinForm development, we have an object, we have a group of events behind it, and you'd simply invoke, say, a click event on a button. The same sort of thing is available in WPF, but again, because of that tree and the interaction between different elements, there is a slightly different approach. Now, to start with, we'll cover something called commanding. Commanding creates a loose coupling between a source item and an action. Think of this like maybe the print button inside your document. You created a word processing type scenario or any application, and you want to allow the user to print. You might have a print button on a ribbon, you might have a menu option that says print, and you might have a keystroke or a shortcut key that allows you to print. So the commanding functionality allows you to create that loose coupling where all those items raise the same event implemented in code. You've got the exact same functionality as you have in more traditional approaches using the direct event. And that might be where you've got a non-click event where the mouse button is pressed. And that's basically where the event's going to be raised and the UI itself is going to handle what happens. But then we get to something that's a little more in line with the way WPF works. And then we've got bubbling and what's called tunneling. Think about that tree stack as we had before. If I've got a button inside another element, inside another element, when I click on the button, one of two things can happen. Either the button itself can handle the event, or it can actually bubble all the way up the tree until such time as somebody says, yes, I want that event, and I'm going to mark you as handled, using the e.handled equals true type scenario. Or obviously it bubbles outside the tree because nobody's listening for it. Conversely, tunneling will actually let the event go down the tree. So it's going to start at the root element and work its way down the tree, waiting to see if anybody is listening for it there. And an example of that, and in most tunneling, you'd have things like a preview. So maybe a preview mouse button. And that way you can track what's happening before it gets to the actual control that it was invoked on. Don't worry, it does become clearer as we build things. That brings us to binding. Now, binding in WPF is very, very powerful. And it's also critical considering we talked about the MVVM concept and the fact that we might want designers to be working with our business logic or our model outside what we traditionally do. And there's 4 actual ways of binding inside WPF. Now, the one-way binding causes a change to the source property to automatically update the target property. But any changes on the target property are not pushed back to the source. So this sort of thing is appropriate if you're looking at maybe a read-only control, such as a stock ticker or something that is not needing to be updated both ways. If there's no need to monitor the changes of the target property, then the one-way binding is definitely the best option because it's going to minimize the amount of overheads that other bindings such as two-way introduce. Now, the two-way binding is going to cause changes to the change from either the source property or the target property to automatically update the other one. So something changes on the UI, it's going to update the underlying model, for example. Something changes the model, it's automatically going to update the UI. Typically, this would be done for things like editable forms or other fully interactive UI. Now, most properties are going to default to one-way binding, but you can actually go through and change the binding properties, and you can also check programmatically as to what the control itself is bound to, one-way or two-way. One of the other binding options is this thing called one-way to source. Now, effectively, it's the reverse of one-way. It's simply going to update the source property when the target changes. And you'd only need to use that if you're wanting to reevaluate something from the UI. I did mention that there were 4 binding methods at this point. So the one that's not illustrated here is what they call the one-time binding. And that's going to cause the source property to initialize the target property once. So think of that as some really cool way to initialize that an object on a startup. But any subsequent changes that are made aren't going to get pushed through. Let's take a look at a couple of different bindings and how useful they can be using the KA ZAML tool. So here we've got a really simple page. Again, we're featuring the grid with a stack panel, a text block, and a text box. What you'll notice is the text block has got this text attribute which has been set using this curly brace. And that's something that you'll get used to with WPF, implementing a custom type binding or attribute. So it's going to come from somewhere else. We can see that the binding element name is set to my text box, which of course, if we look down, the name of our text box is my text box. And it's set that the path is equal to the text property. The text box itself is implemented with its name only and a placeholder or the content. So as you'd expect, as I start typing here, we can see in real time exactly how the binding is going to work. I promised Julian that I would actually say hello to him, like so. So binding can be really quite useful in that sense. You can see how it could not only bind back to our model, but also interact with other elements on the page. Another way of looking at binding might be something like this example. Now here we have, again, a simple page with a grid, and we've implemented a slider control. The slider has been given a name and some other basic properties, and inside the slider, outside the slider, we've got our rectangle which has got its width bound to my slider value and its height set to my slider value. We've simply got a fill of white, and then we're centering it horizontally and vertically. So as you'd expect, as I drag this slider, we're going to see the necessary changes appearing straight on that rectangle in real time. One of the things you'll notice here is there is no code behind. So this is where the binding can become really powerful, both from visual elements and also linking back to that model. To do something like this inside WinForms is no quick task, certainly not as quick as I can do it inside XAML here. While we're inside XAMLpad or KXAML, we can have a quick look at some of the other basic controls that are available. Again, we're starting with a basic page and then a grid, and we can see things such as the menu control. Now, of course, all of this is declared nice and straightforward inside the XAML itself. We can see how let's scroll up, how the menu elements have been created, come through, introducing stack panels with buttons, text boxes, checkboxes, etc. So it's just a slightly different way if you're coming from that WinForms background, but certainly a very, very powerful and extensible option. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio in a second and then take a look at some of the example applications that we provide as a starting point for you to look through what's going on behind the scenes. But one of the questions that I wanted to sort of answer was, what's the story, or what's DevExpress's story for WPF? And why are we in this space, since XAML or WPF is obviously powerful? Well, in essence, it's the same as we are across all the other technologies. Our goal is to provide a range of tools and controls to make your life as a programmer as easy as possible or as productive as possible, so that from the UI aspect, from the visualization, you're not spending a lot of time having to work out things. And when we start looking at simple examples with buttons or text boxes, that's great, but that's not a real-world application. Real world is things like data grids, complex data types, other things like that. So that's where our control set and our scaffolding and things really start to stand on their own. With all our WPF controls, we've got straightforward localization. We've got the inbuilt easy-to-use application templates. And as we'll see in a second, they're all touch enabled. And of course, have full support for MVVM. So let's take a look at a couple of WPF examples. Now, I'm not sure how many people out there are going to be building stock market charts, looking at interactive things such as this. We can see we've got the data grid with built-in charting, but it is cool. You've got the ability, you can see the niceness or the smoothness in which the WPF rendering engine allows you to interact with elements. You've got that nice little animation happening in different parts. And if we take a look at, say, the Realtor World application, so the idea being here that somebody's running a real estate business and want to look at different properties available, we're implementing smooth transitions, you've got nice binding onto elements and other things that are happening, volumes. You can see how that WPF look really gives it a little bit of extra class to what you'd expect inside a WinForms application. But again, they're two very high vis, very charty type things. What about a more office-based type scenario? All of the examples that I'm showing you are all available inside the latest 14.2 installation from our, if you download our demo or if you're an existing customer, they get installed into your public documents folder. Every example we ship full source code for so that you can see exactly how things are built. We talked about the importance of the MVVM concepts and or the design pattern, and this is a good example. See, this is a fictitious company we set up last year called DevAV. It's a mock of a audiovisual company that sells components and products such as TVs, VCRs, DVD players, etc. Now, one of the things that we'll see as we go through the different aspects here, this is very much designed to be a touch or a mock-up of a Windows universal full-screen application. So as I go through, I've got my chart. These are all WPF controls that we supply. Full functionality inside the grid, so I can do searches or I can filter, all the things that you'd expect in a commercial grade application. Now, using the same view model or the same principles as we talked about with the MVVM, I can put a different UI onto the same application. Quickly launch the demo center. Go to our WPF. I actually thought I had it running before, but that's okay. Let's launch the Outlook-inspired app. In fact, I have the source code open while that just launches. So here we can see we've got the separation of concerns. We've got our actual view models, which is the data classes built around the fictitious company and how it's going to interact, so customers, orders, etc., etc. And then we actually have our views themselves, which are the XAML files. If I switch over to here, we can see that using the same underlying engine, the data layer, etc., I've got a more traditional WinForms style or desktop style application with exactly the same thing. This is the same control, it's just set to render in a different mode. As far as the controls themselves are used, we've got things such as the PDF view that's implemented here. We've got the grid control. We're looking at the tree view control, the ribbon control. And what's really, really nice is the fact that inbuilt, so we've got master detail information inside the grids, but inside the framework itself or inside the application, you've got the ability to switch between standard mode and touch mode. So if you're developing an application that might be used on, say, a surface out in the field, you can have your user simply implement that and automatically all of the elements are spaced slightly differently to make it more practical for using a finger instead of a mouse. So you've got out-of-the-box functionality. See these little pop-ups happening as an example. Now the other thing that we provide out of the box are a number of different themes. Here we've got the ability just to switch between the different ribbon themes. So I can choose Office Slim, which is something mimicking the new style of Microsoft Office for Office 2014, or the Tablet Office, which was inspired by the iPad version of Office that Microsoft released. At the end of the day, it just means that you've got more flexibility and functionality at your fingertips through these control sets. Now, as far as taking a look at all the different things that are available inside WPF, if you launch the Demo Center, everything is listed. You can look at examples, and let's just quickly show one. The source behind the example to show you exactly what's going on. So we can see in just an example here of some data, the data grid doing some cell merging. You can actually not only see the demo, but you can also look at the XAML that went behind creating that data grid. If you were going to get started with WPF before we start building the sample application next time, then open Visual Studio after you've installed the DevExpress controls, click on New Project, and select the DevExpress Template Gallery option from the templates here. When that opens up, make sure that the platform is set to WPF, because our template gallery supports all of our different controls. If you want to hand stepping through exactly what your project should look like, there's the inbuilt project wizard, as well as a basic sample ribbon application, a Microsoft Word-inspired solution, which effectively gives you a complete rich text editor application ready to use. There's the Microsoft Outlook inspired application, and then a tile application. I'm going to choose Project Wizard here. I'm going to choose Run Wizard. At this point, the Project Wizard is going to step me through what I want to actually implement. For example, do I want a theme-supported window? And from here I could say, yes, I want the ribbon support. I can come through and select what theme I want it to be based on as my initial starting point. So I can say Office 2013, and then I can literally go through and pick the style of interface that I want for this application. It may be just a simple data entry form. And so as I step through, I'm going to get more options until ultimately I get to create my project. And this is going to lay out that foundation for starting to play with your very first WPF application. Unfortunately, Visual Studio may take a minute or two while performing this task. If you haven't seen a WPF project before, we've got a traditional solution explorer view here showing all the different libraries that our wizards imported. You've got your main app XAML file and your main window file. Now, I'll minimize that for a second. Again, wait for Visual Studio. And you can see that typically Visual Studio will break the window into two. It's going to show you design view and your XAML view. It lets you switch those views, or even, which I prefer, just working with one with the other. Now, we can see inside the XAML here, it's created this DX ribbon root element, and as we go through, it's automatically added some basic information for us. If I wanted to have a look at the design, I can do that as well. Whilst we'll be going into it in more detail next week, inside the DevExpress submenu here, you've got this WPF controls option that allows you to enable or disable the instant layout editor. So when you create a new XAML form, for example, I'll just come along and tell it that I want a new window. What's going to happen is you can see the DevExpress assistant sitting inside that window ready to help. So if I wanted to, I could turn that off, or I can come along and choose exactly what it is I want it to work with. So if I wanted to implement a basic grid, table view, it's going to go along and create that for me. So that certainly makes life a little easier when working with these things. If I was just to run that application, having written no code behind at this stage, we should see a nice presented Office 2016. Let's minimize all those windows. And let's just go to webinar telling me that there's a conflict between me wanting to keep my screen clean and what it's doing. So we've got a navigation bar. We can see some of these controls that are out of the box. So beautiful, rich editors, being able to implement photos, and a system that's already laid out for me. So that sets the stage for diving in next time in more depth and building a simple data-bound application using some of those principles. Now obviously there is a lot more involved with the WPF underlying frameworks. There's so many different angles or aspects of things that we could sit and talk about. But what I wanted to do was just give you that quick overview as to the anatomy of an application and what goes behind.
And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Paul. Thank you for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.